You're listening to the Skylight Books podcast. We're an independent, general interest bookstore putting great reads in the hands of people in the Los Feliz neighborhood of Los Angeles. Hosted by resident Skylighters, we're here to bring you new and exciting author conversations, group reads, and bookseller chats. Happy listening.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Skylight Books CROWDCAST channel. We are very excited to be here tonight with Benjamin Rosenbaum and Ted Chiang to celebrate the paperback release of The Unraveling. Thank you all for being here. Ted Chiang's fiction has won 4 Hugo, 4 Nebula, and 4 Locus Awards and has been featured in the Best American Short Stories. His debut collection, Stories of Your Life and Others, has been translated into 21 languages. He was born in Port Jefferson, New York, and currently lives near Seattle, Washington. Benjamin Rosenbaum has been nominated for the Hugo, Nebula, BSFA, Sturgeon, and World Fantasy Awards. He is the author of the short story collection The Ant King and Other Stories and the Jewish historical fantasy tabletop role-playing game Dream Apart. Originally from Arlington, Virginia, he lives near Basel, Switzerland with his wife and children. Please join me in first giving Ben a huge welcome to the stage while he reads from The Unraveling. Yay.
Thanks so much. Well, okay. Fift was almost 5. And it wasn't like Zir to be asleep in all of their bodies. He wasn't a baby anymore. He was old enough for school, old enough to walk all alone across the habitation, down the spoke to the great and buzzing center of Fu. But he had been wound up with excitement for days, practically dancing around the house. Father Missisk had laughed. Father Smistria had shooed Zir out of the supper garden. Father Frill had taken Zir to the bathing room to swim back and forth to calm Zir down. Just before supper, he'd finally collapsed twice in the atrium and curled up on the tiered balcony. Father Arevio and Father Squell had carried Zir in those 2 bodies back to Zir room. He'd managed to stay awake in Zir third body through most of supper, blinking hugely, breathing in through Zir nose and trying to sit up straight as waves of deep blue slumber from Zir 2 sleeping brains washed through Zir. By supper's end, he couldn't stand up any longer, and Father Squell carried Zir last body to bed. Muddy dreams, sitting on a wooden floor in a long hall, of Zir name being called, of realizing he hadn't worn Zir gowns after all, but was somehow humiliatingly dressed in Father Frill's golden bells instead, the other children laughing at Zir, and dizziness, and suddenly, surreally, the hall being full of flutterbys, their translucent wings fluttering, their projection surfaces glittering. Then someone was stroking Fift's eyebrow gently. He tried to nestle further down into the blankets, but the someone started gently pulling on Zir earlobe. Z opened Zir eyes, and it was Father Squell. "Good morning, little Cubblehead," V said. "You have a big day today." Father Squell was slim and rosy-skinned and smelled like soap and flowers. Fift crawled into Squell's lap and flung Zir arms around them and pressed Zir nose between their bosoms. V was dressed in glittery red fabric, soft and slippery under Fift's fingers. Squell was bald with coppery metal spikes extruding from the skin of her scalp. Sometimes Father Frill teased her about the spikes, which weren't fashionable anymore. And sometimes that made Father Squell storm out of the room because V was a little vain. Father Squell had never been much of a fighter, the other fathers said, but V had a body in the asteroids, and that was something amazing. Squell reached over, Fift still in her lap, and started stroking the eyebrow of another of Fift's bodies. Fift sneezed in that body, and then sneezed in the other 2. That was funny, and Z started to giggle. Now Z was all awake. "Up, little Cubblehead," Squell said. "Up." Fift crawled out of bed, careful not to crawl over herself. It always made Zir a little restless to be all together, all 3 bodies in the same room. That wasn't good. It was because Zir's somatic integration wasn't totally successful, which is why Z kept having to see pedagogical expert Pnim Moralazic Foundelli of Name Registry Nomadic Lance 12. Pedagogical expert Pnim Moralazic Foundelli had put an awful nag agent in Fift's mind to tell Zir to look herself in the eye, play in a coordinated manner, and do the exercises. was nagging now, but Fift ignored it. As he looked under the bed for their gowns, they weren't there. Fift closed her eyes. He wasn't so good at using the feed with them open yet, and looked all over the house. The gowns weren't in the balcony, or the atrium, or the small mat room, or the breakfast room. Father Zarevio's Mistria Frill and another of Father Squell's bodies were in the breakfast room, already eating. Father Missisk was arguing with the kitchen. Where are my gowns? Fift asked her agents, but the agents didn't say anything. Maybe Z was doing it wrong somehow. Father Squells, he said, opening his eyes, I can't find my gowns, and my agents can't either. I composted your gowns. They were old, Father Squell said. Go down in the bathing room, and I'll get washed. I'll make you some new clothes. Fift's heart began to pound. The gowns weren't old. They just only came out of the oven a week ago. But I want those gowns, he said. Squell opened the door. You can't have those gowns. Those gowns are compost. Bathing. V snatched Fift up, one of their bodies under her arm, the wrist of another caught in their other hand. Fift was up in the air, wriggling, and was held by the arm, pulling against Squell's grip, and was on their hands and knees by the bed, looking desperately under it for their gowns. They weren't old, Z said, their voice wavering. Fift, Squell said, exasperated. That's enough for Kumru's sake, today of all days. V dragged Fift, or as much as Fift as he'd managed to get a hold of, out the door. Another of Squell's bodies, this one with silvery spikes in its head, came hurrying down the hall. I want them back, Fift said. She wouldn't cry. She wasn't a baby anymore. She was a big Staid child, and Staids don't cry. She wouldn't cry. She wouldn't even shout or emphasize. Today of all days, she would stay calm and clear. She was still struggling a little in Squell's arms, so Squell handled the struggling body off of himself as we came in the door. They are compost, Squell said, reddening, in the body with the silver spikes, while the one with the copper spikes came into the room. They have gone down the sluice and dissolved. Your gowns are now part of the nutrient flow. They could be anywhere in Fullbelly. They will probably be part of your breakfast next week. Fift gasped. She didn't want to eat their gowns? There was a cold lump in her stomach. Fift caught their third body. Father Missisk came down the corridor double-bodied. He was bigger than Squell, broad-chested and square-jawed, with a mane of blood-red hair and sunset-orange skin traced all over with white squiggles. Missisk was wearing dancing pants. I'm going to skip a bit where Fift's fathers basically argue and try to get Fift under control. It's trying to get a toddler dressed, difficult. Smistria comes up and is arguing with Missisk and Squell. Come on, Fift, Missisk said coaxingly. Put there down, Smistria said. I cannot believe you are wrestling and flying about with a Staid child who in less than 3 hours. Oh, give it a rest, me, Missisk said, sort of threatening. He turned away from Fift and Squell and towards Smistria. Smistria stepped fully out into the corridor, putting her face next to Missisk's. It got like thunder between them, but Fift knew they wouldn't hit each other. Grown-up Vails only hit each other on the mats. Still, he hugged Squell closer, one body squashed against her soft chest, one body hugging Squell's leg, one body pulling back through the doorway, squeezed all her eyes shut and dimmed the house feed so he couldn't see that way either. Behind their eyes, Fift could only see the pale blue gowns. It was just like in their dream. She'd lost her gowns and would have to go wearing bells like Father Frill. She shuddered. I don't want my gowns to be in the compost, she said, as reasonably as he could manage. Oh, will you shut up about your gowns, Squell said. No one cares about your gowns. That's not true, Mrs. boomed, shocked. It is true, Smistria said, and Fift could feel a sob ballooning inside. She tried to hold it in, but it grew and grew and... Beloveds, said Father Grobard. Fift opened her eyes. Father Grobard had come silently, single-bodied, up the corridor, to stand behind Squell. He was shorter than Mrs. and Smistria, the same height as Squell, but more solid, broad and flat like a stone. When Father Grobard stood still, it looked like he would never move again. Their shift was plain and simple and white. Their skin was mottled creamy brown with the same fine golden fuzz of hair everywhere, even at the top of their head. Grobby, Squell said, we are trying to get her ready, but it's quite... Well, it's Grobard's show, Smistria said. It's up to you and Pip today, Grobard, isn't it? So why don't you get her ready? Grobard held out their hand. Fift swallowed, then slid down from Squell's arms and went to take it. Grobard, Missisk said, are you sure Fift is ready for this? Is it really... Yes, Grobard said. Lindsay looked at Miss Isk, her face as calm as ever. She raised one eyebrow, just a little, then looked back at Fift's other bodies. She held out her other hand. Squell let go, and Fift gathered herself, holding one of Father Grobert's hands on one side, one on the other, and catching hold of the back of Grobert's shift. They went down to the bathing room. My gowns weren't old, Fift said, on the stairs. They came out of the oven a week ago. No, they weren't old, Grobert said, but they were blue. Blue is a Vail color, the color of the crashing, restless sea. You are a Staid, and today you will enter the first gate of logic. You couldn't do that wearing blue gowns. Oh, Fift said. Robert sat by the side of the bathing pool, their hands in their lap, their legs in the water, while Fift scrubs herself soapy. Father Grobert, Fift said, why are you a father? What do you mean? Father Grobert asked. I am your father, Fift. You are my child. But why aren't you a mother? Mother Pip is a mother, and she's, you're both. Robert's forehead wrinkled briefly, then it smoothed, and their lips quirked in the tiny suggestion of a smile. Uh-huh, I see. Because you have only one Staid father and the rest are Vails. You think that being a father is a Vailish thing to be. You think fathers should be V's and mothers should be Z's? Fift stopped mid-scrub and frowned. What about your friends? Are all your friends mother Staids? Are they all Z? Or are some of them V? Robert paused a moment, then gently, what about your friend Umlish Menemu of Manathas cohort? Isn't their mother a Vail? Oh, Fift said and frowned again. Well, what makes someone a mother? Your mother carried you in their womb, Fift. You grew inside their belly. You were born out of their vagina into the world. Some families don't have children that way, so in some families, all the parents are fathers. But we are quite traditional. Indeed, we are all Cumruists, except for Father Thurm. And Cumruists believe that biological birth is sacred, so you have a mother. Fift knew that, though it still seems strange. Z'd been inside Mother Pip for 10 months, single-bodied, because their other two bodies hadn't been fashioned yet. That was an eerie thought. Tiny, helpless, one-bodied, unbreathing, their nut-sized heart drawing nutrients from Pip's blood. Why did Pip get to be my mother? Now, Grobert was clearly smiling. Have you ever tried to refuse your mother Pip anything? Fift shook her head solemnly. It doesn't work. She's always the younger sibling. That meant the one who won the argument, but it also meant the littlest child if there was more than one in a family. Fift wasn't sure why it meant both of those things. Grobert chuckled. Yes, there was a little bit of debate, but I think we all knew Pip would prevail. She had a uterus and a vagina enabled, and made sure we all had penises for the impregnation. It was an exciting time. Fift pulled up the feed and looked up penises. They were for squirting sperm, which helped decide what the baby would be like. The egg would sort through all the sperm and pick the genes it wanted, but the parents had to publish something or other to get the genome approved, and after that it got too complicated. If someone got a penis, they'd have one on each body, dangling between their legs. Do you still have penises? One on each body? Yes, I kept mine, Grobert said. They went well with the rest of me, and I don't like too many changes. Can I have penises? Z said. I suppose, if you like, Grobert said, but not today. Today you have something more important to do. And now I see that your father has baked new clothes, so rinse off and let's go upstairs. That was it.
Okay. Okay.
Hey, Ted.
So, Ben. Hey, Ben. So, this novel, I guess in some ways, I think of it as like maybe the most Ben Rosenbaumian novel I can
funny.
imagine.
What a coincidence.
Well, because well, because I think it is sometimes the case that when you know someone, when you read their work, the aspects of their personality from your personal interaction with them are not totally they're not at the forefront of the novel that the person's written. But I think that in this book, many of the things that we hear you talk about are things featured prominently in this novel. Because when I read the novel, I was thinking like, okay, so this seems to be a novel about like parenting and gender and reputation economies and surrealism and maybe Talmud. And I was like, yeah, those are all
wheelhouse
that Ben is totally interested in. So this seems to be very much just a mixture of all the things that you love talking about. You found a way to combine them all into one novel.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about the gender relations in this novel.
Yeah.
So
I should say, before you started on that, I just want to say what you said about putting everything in there is actually, we were talking beforehand about Clarion, and I remember Octavia Butler saying that at Clarion. Basically, that stuck with me, that she was like, it takes so long to write a novel that don't hold anything back. Like whatever you're currently obsessed with, you just pour it all in there. So I was definitely like following that direction.
I mean, and that's fair. Although although I do wonder, like like if what's your second novel going to look like?
Good question. But I think that was her point: was pour everything in there. There'll be more later. Your obsessions will shift over time. You'll discover new layers to them. Yeah, whatever.
Absolutely.
That's what she was saying: was don't hold anything back. There'll be plenty for the second.
Yes, and I can totally get behind that.
Yeah.
So okay, so gender in this novel. So the two genders in this novel are Vail and Staid.
Yeah.
And I remember you once talking about this a long time ago, because you've been working on this novel for a very long time.
Yeah.
It's had many sort of iterations and incarnations.
Yeah.
And I remember that you said at one point that you were trying to you're trying to envision two genders that would not be read as male and female.
Yeah.
And you said that because the way we conventionally think of male and female, as a very sort of rough approximation, we think of like male and female as being analogous to hard and soft. And
like that's our ideology around it, right? As we've decided there's a hard kind of person and a soft kind of person.
Yes. And you said you wanted to try and make two genders that you envisioned them as fast and slow.
Yeah.
So like I remember there was at one point you had written an early draft of this novel and you got feedback from Megan McCarran.
Yes, crucial feedback from Megan. Shout out to Megan McCarran.
And she, I mean, my recollection is that, from what you said was that like she had pointed out that you had sort of unconsciously like put like all the things like maybe that you disliked about women into one of the genders.
What she said was that I took all the things I disliked about being a man and stuck that into the female. And at that point, in 2012, when this conversation was happening, by the way, I did not yet believe that readers were gonna. I was writing the book with she and he, and I was like, well, we'll just arbitrarily assign she and he, because I just didn't think anyone could get through a book with neopronouns. And I have to say, Liz Gorinsky, who is here tonight, the editor, for this book, is the one who insisted on my having the courage of my convictions. It was like, are you sure you don't want to actually just use neopronouns? Because there's no way people are going to read, no matter which one you make he and which one you make she. But at the time, back in 2012, so eventually I did decide to do that, but which I'm very glad of now. But in 2012, I was like, well, there has to be a he and there has to be a she. And then what she was basically saying was, and I tried to mix up the, like they were only theoretically, they were translated into English with these two pronouns, but really they were these two different genders. But Megan's reaction was like, you took all the stuff you don't like about being a boy and put it into the girl gender, and that's so her advice was first to switch the pronouns, which was the first thing I did. And I actually, after that, in order to keep myself honest, because I just realized like, it is impossible not to read through our lens of gender, like you keep doing it. And so for a while, I was internally in the body of the text, writing it in neopronouns and using Scrivener to compile two different PDFs, one with he, she, and the other with she, he. So I'd read it twice, and it was amazing how different, how a scene would read totally differently if you flip the pronouns, even though nothing was happening diegetically in the text. I mean, it was very clear that I wasn't changing their genders, but just changing the translation, just translating one of the pronouns, which still referred to the same reference as, using the word she, was still totally shift the reading. So eventually I came around to neopronouns, and I feel like, it is in some ways an impossible project. We can't help reading through the genders that we have, in a way. Maybe now we can better. Like, the world has changed since, even just in the last 10 years since I was having that conversation with Megan McCarran. I feel like it's easier, but at least I notice people slip up in different directions. Like, at least when people are accidentally talking about, Fift, it at least splits the crowd whether people accidentally use she or he, for Fift or for Shria or for the characters in the book. So I'm like, at least, it's destabilized, And anyway, that's what the real goal of it is, also to estrange and artificialize. Like, ideally, when you're reading this book, once you get through the first, I apologize to everyone for the work that you have to do to get into the book, and the first 30 pages might be hard going. But once you've absorbed the conventions in the world and everything, ideally what happens is you acclimate, you acculturate, so that in fact you find it slightly embarrassing when staid people start acting overly Vailish, and Vailish people start acting. You sort of acclimate to the conventions, and you start treating these things as real, and then you go, wait a minute, this is absurd. There aren't really fast sort of people and soft sort of people, and then maybe take that revelation home with you. Anyway, to our world.
Okay, so so about the more to follow up on the Vail and the Staid genders.
Yeah.
You have an opening epigraph in the novel.
Yeah.
And there's a line in it which says that every contest harkens back to that first contest over the love of the parent, when younger displaces older.
Yeah, right.
And so that suggests to me that in some ways, like, the Vail and Staid divide is it's a kind of sibling rivalry divide.
Interesting, huh? I had thought of birth order as being orthogonal to Vail and Staid. It's random whether the firstborn is Vail or Staid, and birth order has a lot to do with class in the society. So there's a lot, like, latter-born tend to be rich. It's a reputation. It's a pride economy, actually, but latter-born tend to be rich. They don't have money, but rich, and elder-born poor and aggrieved, and so on. But I guess it is, in a way, it does feel a little like the relationship between the genders does feel a little. There is a way in which it's like a sibling rivalry. Partly it's that I wanted to use sibling rivalry as one of their sort of fundamental paradigms that they through which they see the world. I feel like a lot of times, I wanted to make up a new society, and I wanted the things in society to feel both strange and also familiar. So I wanted not to take totally absurd things that had no basis in our experience, but I wanted to take moments that there are emotions that are typical of humans that people often feel. One that a human could experience, but some of them your culture like elevates to this really important major feature that it builds all this ideology around, and other ones it doesn't. So there are cultures, like if you go back to, there are cultures where like jealousy, like it's a natural feeling, like you have a lover and that lover takes another lover. Now, a natural thing you might feel is jealousy. And there are cultures where like a natural thing to do then is like have a war, right? Like that's such an important definition of like the society is based on that, like you should have a blood feud. And there are other societies, I was reading about like pre-contact Hawaii, where basically the general attitude is grow up. Like of course everybody feels jealous, but like that as you mature you should be able to master that emotion, and it should be no big deal if your lover takes another lover. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's human societies can do all kinds of things with what emotions they center or don't. So I wanted to take this emotion, which that's the feeling of like when you're the older sibling and the younger sibling arrives and all of a sudden the parents are paying attention to them. Like that's a real feeling, but we acknowledge that exists, but we don't make that like the cornerstone of society. It's not something we particularly mythologize. They've like mythologized that the way we mythologize mother love, right? Like mothers are like these self-sacrificing, like as soon as the mother's love for the baby is this pure, which is something that many parents feel, not all the time. Sometimes you're like, my kid is a pain in the ass, and sometimes you're like, oh my God, my heart is full of love. But we've decided that that's both a central and also a gendered emotion, and we're going to build a whole edifice around it. Anyway, so I was like, what if they just, and I was watching my kids grow up, and birth order seemed like such a central fact of their universe, right? It's like, when they would watch shows where there was an older sibling and a younger sibling, that was a bigger deal than gender. My daughter totally identified with Arthur the Aardvark, even though the older sibling was a boy and the younger sibling was a girl, but she was totally the older sibling, because the fact of her being an older sibling was such a much more central fact of her existence than that of being a girl. Like being a girl, that sure, she noticed that sometimes, but being an older sibling was like a full-time job. So, I was like, what if a society made that more central? Yeah. Organizing metaphors, Jed says in the chat. Yes, an organizing metaphor for their social world.
So I'm curious, have you heard of Frank Selloway's book, Born to Rebel?
No.
Because he was a psychologist. He is a psychologist. He had this thesis that that firstborns tend to be more sort of conservative, and
interesting.
Younger-borns tend to be more later-borns tend to be more revolutionary. And he had this whole book where he offered this statistical argument that where he tried to characterize famous people in history, like whether they were sort of trying to maintain the status quo or return the status quo.
Well, and it'd be really interesting to
find a correlation to their birth order.
Well, and it would be very interesting to look at whether they lived in primogeniture societies, right? So if he's going famous people in like British history, in which the eldest literally inherits everything, it's like, well, they have a hell of a, if you compare that to, I don't know, Mongolian ultimogeniture, like, is that true in societies where the youngest inherits? Like, I don't know, like, you know what I mean? It's sort of, and I think that we also, I just think this generation, like at the moment we live in a world where it's not that inheritance isn't a big deal, because it's still a big deal, but it's certainly, there's this whole emphasis on like the emotional life of little kids that I think wasn't such a big, anyway. That seems really interesting data, and also probably very rooted in like what society and era we're talking about, right? Anyway.
Well, I mean, I think his thesis received a lot of pushback, but it was like an interesting thesis. It just seemed like it was just something that I was reminded of.
And I mean, I'm less interested in whether it's true, and I'm more interested that they think it's true, right? Like this book is full of a lot of things that's like, well, they think that's true, right? I kind of think it's a lot of what they think is true, I think is absurd, but I wouldn't I? I mean, I'm not from there, so for them it's as real, and that's the kind of game that to play in writing it in a way is like, can we make this feel as real as our own fundamentally absurd notions?
Okay, so all right, so okay, here's another topic. So Fift is so Fift's mother is a banker historian, and Fift is an apprentice banker historian.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think, you know, like, it's not entirely clear what a banker historian does. You know, it's a, you know, I think, you know, you kind of hint at it, but you don't, you know, really, lay it out. But I guess what it seemed to me is that I feel like, you know, it is tied to a conversation that you and I have had about one of your previous stories, the guy who worked for money.
Yeah.
Which addressed the question of you know, some of the issues raised by, like, David Graeber's book Debt. And
that was a big influence on this book. Yeah, Graeber's for Debt, the First 5,000 Years.
Yeah. And the idea that you know,
perhaps this book should be called Debt, the Next 500,000 Years. No, kidding. All right, go on.
I mean, well, which, you know, would that you know, considering that his book is like 600 pages and it only covers a mere 5,000 years.
Only covered 5,000 years. That's right.
And, you know, here you're covering, you know, 100 times that. You know,
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you know, that would make you sort of just the master of brevity.
Yeah, which is how everyone thinks of me.
Indeed. But so in, you know, in one of the things that Graeber talks about in his book is how, you know, sort of before there was money, people remembered what they owed each other, and that was sort of one of the fundamental ways that they understood their social relationships, you know.
And they either did or didn't quantify. I mean, there's a difference between I owe you exactly this much, and if I give it to you, we're quits, and like I owe you and you owe me, and that relationship of mutual debt will obtain forever. You know what I mean? Which is a lot of relationships, which is why you don't tell people how much a birthday present is. Like the difference between like a gift isn't a gift if it's, you know what I mean? If it's like, well, that's exactly $18.03. You know what I mean? That there are taboos around that, because it's essentially like, if it can be made even and settled, then it's not a bond. And our world is run on this specific kind of transaction, which is designed for strangers to relate to each other. Like, it's designed for low information context for strangers to be able to perform a transaction and then have no bond afterwards. It's just, you know, that's the world we live in.
I mean, Graeber says that, money was invented.
That's Graeber's thesis.
Yeah, money was invented to allow you to square accounts with someone you never intended to see again.
Exactly. Particularly if you're a mercenary and you've just melted down all the gold in a temple, basically, Graeber is saying. Yeah. And so part of I think where you're going with this, part of both of those stories is, well, what if essentially information technology allows us to be in a high information situation, even with distant strangers, and therefore, like, does something that, if money is a hack for dealing with for doing spot transaction barter with strangers, like, once we live in a rich information world where everybody knows everything about everybody, does that change the equation? Do we then have, you know what I mean? Does exchange economy stops being as much of a central mechanism? Maybe.
I mean, and so, you know, so that's, and thus you get perhaps banker historians. I
have to tell you that there is a glossary at the end of the book. I mean, not everybody finds it, but it does tell you what a banker historian is. Ahem. Banker historian, a professional responsible for emotional accounting, formalizing the story of a person or institution's emotional state so as to optimally influence their ratings.
Yes. I saw that, but I guess.
Okay.
So and that, you know, although like I guess I maybe the reason I'm pushing on this because like I'm not sure like is that because like that is not as clear to me from reading the novel.
Yeah.
But also because I guess I wonder about the relationship between what I take to be that job description and this other thing that like you and I have talked about sort of recording social relationships through what people owe each other.
Yeah, and well, in other words, I think much like in The Guy Who Worked for Money, in which there are these mechanisms like Hubbub or whatever, where computers are helping everybody decide what they think of everybody else, and therefore your transactions with people are more like your transaction with someone you know very well and have a strong opinion about whether they should have that thing or not than they are like with a stranger. And similarly here, I mean, it's again, and both of them are mutually panoptic societies, sort of everybody's watching everybody else, and so there's this vast amount of data about what everybody, which everyone uses to judge each other. Both of these stories are in some regards having to do with living in Switzerland, which is a very communal society in which it's very gossip driven. I mean, not gossip, that's mean, and maybe that's not the right word. There's a lot of social control but also mutual care that people fall through the cracks much easier in America. So I'm not throwing Switzerland under the bus, but anyway, but it's partly being an immigrant that it's to observe Switzerland. It's like a alien landscape for me. Anyway, the idea of the banker historian is that you would naturally try to spin that, right? Like, so everybody in the world, there's like all these ratings. They have all observed what you're doing. They're forming opinions, but you would definitely want like a spin doctor, like a PR person who's going to like reframe and clarify and quantify, like retell the story of your like emotional states and behaviors and everything in a way that will maximally, put your best foot forward. So it would, and a lot of like there's some kind of emotional transactionality where they actually don't think of it strictly as a reputation economy. In fact, Vail says it's not a classical reputation economy. It's a pride economy. So it has something to do with the notion is that somehow when you encounter someone, there's an emblematic scene where they're trying to get on a bridge or to a lift, like onto an elevator, and the elevator operator is basically like having this showdown with them emotionally, where the elevator operator is just going to decide, and sort of like someone is going to submit, like either they're going to be turned away or the elevator operator is going to let them on the elevator, and every transaction is some kind of contest like between siblings, right? Like where it's like who's going to win this game of emotional chicken. They actually think of it more like that, whereas The Guy Who Worked for Money is more of a strict reputational economy. Anyway, but that has a lot to do, and so a lot of it is like your internal state. And there's the bit where there's the stock market guy, Zango Django, and it's about people betting on their own. They're taking bets on their own like likelihood of falling apart emotionally. Like there's a way in which there's a very meta thing where like your emotional states are very visible, and therefore if you so partly the banker historian is about external spin, which is what it would be in a reputation economy, but partly it's about the story you're telling yourself about what happened and therefore how you feel about it. And there's like a feedback loop where how you feel about it affects how the next transaction is going to go. Something like that. But I mean, you're right to point to like, do I really know what it is? I couldn't design this. I mean, if somebody was like, okay, Ben, we're going to actually do this, what do banker historians do? I don't you know what I mean? Like there's a way in which it's definitely the kind of science fiction where you were gesturing beyond, right? It's not where you're specifying exactly. It's where like this association of words is gesturing at something. It's not pure surrealism. Like I think there's a there in banker historian, but it's, I don't know that I'm meant to understand it fully. Do you know what I mean? Like,
sure. I get that. But I guess I had sort of thought that I mean, maybe one way to to articulate this is that I feel like the role of banker historian is almost like the way that you have it described in your glossary. It might almost be like a lawyer you hire there people would have competing banker historians.
Oh yeah.
As opposed to there being a you'd have your own banker historian to sort of argue your case in a fashion,
that's
as opposed to.
I mean, although arguing a case implies a one-on-one, this it's not really necessarily. I mean, that might happen in a transaction where you have a specific dispute with one person, but this is partly about after the fact, after all those transactions, which were individual face-offs happened, you're also broadcasting to the world. So when someone enters a transaction with you, when they go to this face-to-face with you, like they do when they confront the people like Fortune and Predoria, they go in knowing a lot about that person, what their status is, what their, you know what I mean? They go in to have this confrontation to try to get someone to apologize, knowing a bunch of stuff about them because there's a rich record about them and all these people taking bets on them, whether they're going to prosper or not. Like everyone is so under the microscope the way that a famous person is today, which is sort of an easy prediction. The democratizing, there's so many ways in which people in many ways in which we in 2022 live in ways that only famous people did in 1980. That's at this point that's kind of an obvious observation, like with social media and everything. Like everybody's 15 minutes, whatever. But it was clever when McLuhan said it in the 60s. But it's all, in other words, the way a banker historian works in the book is more like a CPA than a lawyer. So it's more like you're preparing your annual report and you are publishing it to the world, and it shows all the transactions and dots all the I's and checks all the crosses all the T's, and produces a coherent accounting. And then when you're in some transaction with someone where you want something from them and they want something from you and there's some kind of struggle, you've got that to back you up. You've got this record of who you are and what you've done and how that is, that tells the story. So it's an emotional narrative, but it's also kind of very quantitative because there's all this number crunching behind all of this stuff about reputation, and their emotions are very quantified in this world. So it's like a CPA for your emotions.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, here's a question I have about, so the characters, almost every character, they are multi-bodied. Mm-hmm. They have like 3 bodies or maybe more. And there is a, in one of, again, at the sort of the appendix material at the end, there's a note which says that this instituting many bodies for each individual, that was it's implied that was a deliberate attempt to prevent uploading.
That note is there for you, Ted.
Okay. Yes. So I'm asking, what's that about? How's that?
Yeah.
How
features.
How I'm going to ask the question. How does that prevent uploading, especially considering that the amount of infrastructure that sort of implied in between sort of sharing states between multiple bodies, that would be so much easier to do if you were virtual, if you were digital. So it seems like if this polysomatic version of identity was considered desirable, that would, I feel like, wouldn't that encourage uploading rather than
different implementation? So partly more, if you're interested in this question, which is sort of in the Thave bit and then in the notes at the end, and not that much in this book, it is much more central to Bereft I Come to a Nameless World, which is the sequel-ish to the Unraveling. That was a story in Asimov's last year or the year before. Anyway, there's a short story. You can find it on the website, Bereft I Come to a Nameless World. And that is specifically about Thave and Siob, who appears in the end, talking about this. And the original narrative, some of the bones of this book that didn't make it much into this book, but that are in that story, and maybe some other forthcoming stories, maybe if I get them into shape, had to do with Thave's a consultant for civilizations, right? Thave's the one who they meet, who's 50,000 years, or actually 500,000 years old, but has been on the planet for 20,000 years, and they discuss all these. Thave is I wanted to, often we have aliens as like secret nemesis who are controlling the world, or they're like invading, or Thavi is just like a person who has a job who lives on this planet, and it's like one of the few aliens on the planet, but everyone knows who Thavi is. You can look Thavi up and the equivalent of Wikipedia. But Thave's job is to nudge the society and to try. Thave tries to have an influence on the society. And so when Thave says I encourage this trend, Thave is partly talking about, there's a lot of like one of the spiritual ancestors of the book, in which I'm in dialogue and not always agreement, is foundation, right? So there's a way in which Thave is a very second foundation kind of like person trying to influence the grand sweep of history, right? And one thing Thave tries to do is shift sort of cultural trends and whatever. And the model is that this is a very culture and technology and so on is very chaotic. So like you might end up in a totally different place based on like shifting conditions, like because it's a positive feedback loop, right? The culture changes the society, which changes the desires, which produce the desire to create the technology. So you might end up with hovercrafts, or you might end up with, you know what I mean? Like it's not a deterministic like tech tree, right? So the way that they are multi-bodied is not that they have a digital representation of consciousness and then import that into another body. It's actually that because there's no privileging of the brain. They're just as interesting as replicating the state of your liver as the state of your brain, right? Like there are little machines in every cell that just try to sync up the state with the other cells. They don't attempt to construct a model. They don't attempt to. They try to sync all the, right. So if you get punched, like there's a bit where Fift can tell what body Shria was in a fight in, because bruises travel, but lacerations don't. So like if there's a tear in the skin that doesn't get replicated, that's too complicated on that. But the cells that are bruised will try to bruise, they'll like average out the state between the bruised cells on that arm and the not bruised cells on that arm. So it's a very, I was just re-listening to our that was just released because we just put it out, the podcast that you and I did for Mohan Raj and Rosenbaum Are Humans, Speculative Literature Foundation, and we were talking about our anti-singularitarian feels and the irreducibly embodiedness of consciousness, and which is not to say that bodies are static or they're very malleable, but there's always a body in some sense, and so it's this very embodied version of consciousness. It's like, okay, well, you want to be more than one place at once, you want to live forever, you want to expand your thing. What if we do this, right? What if we take your actual body and make it map to this actual other body, which is very different than saying let's abstract yourself to like this notional version of yourself, which can live in a purely simulated world and have anything it wants. And the thing that Thave and Siab are particularly terrified of is that they are not so much interested in the longevity of individuals, but in the longevity of societies. And that it turns out in this universe that like fully virtual societies happen and they're very brittle. Like everything goes really fast and there's very little friction and you can create the world as you like, and you deviate very quickly from like, you wander very quickly in like cultural space, and then like one bam beam takes the whole thing down. Like everything's just a wash of bits after, like it's amazing if one lasts 100 years. So for them, that's like they're terrified of situations in which societies are going to all upload themselves and use up all the resources doing that. And so whatever peons don't get uploaded are going to starve, and whatever people are in the big Mariashka brain will have a lot of fun until like suddenly there's a fad for extinguishing yourself and then there's nothing left. Anyway, I'm not saying this is true, but in this world, like that's the thing they're worried about, is this sort of fragility of the, and so they like the, so, and there's this sense that Thave can't just stop them from doing it, but he can kind of nudge in another direction. V can kind of, Thave's gendered state, can nudge in another direction and end them up in something that the same sort of fear of death, desire, greed for experience, all that stuff can kind of like a Betamax VHS situation. Like it's like, well, maybe I can't keep you from doing something, but I'll offer this alternative, and like you'll go off into that. You know what I mean? Beta. That's not the best analogy. There's probably a better analogy of like two competing technologies that were actually fundamentally different, and one of them stole the other's thunder. I feel like I should have a good analogy for this. It's like, I don't know. It's like
maybe electric cars and internal combustion.
Yeah, like a Tesla era. I don't know. Yeah, exactly. Like internal combustion just got enough of a push ahead that took over, or like alternating current or whatever. One of those moments in history where it's like this just gets the first mover advantage. This just gets the push behind it, and the wind gets sucked out of the other thing. So that's kind of what Thave was going after with them.
Well, okay, so I think we're getting the hook.
It might be. Yeah, we might be getting the hook.
No, you more than welcome to ask another question. I can go away again. Maybe one
more question from Ted, and then I don't know if we have a lot from the audience.
Okay. All right. Okay. Let me ask one more. Okay. So so one thing I wondered about is that in this society that you depict, people have very long lifespans. They live hundreds of years.
Mm-hmm.
But the scenes where we see like Fift, we see Fift when Fift is very young, and then 10 years later we see Fift sort of as a teenager,
mm-hmm.
and then a couple decades later we see Fift as an adult.
Yeah.
And so Fift's behavior in all those, they map I was able to map them very readily onto like, young child, teenager, adult, as I recognize them.
Yes.
And so
I know where you're going with this.
Well, let me ask the question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So my question is, if someone can expect to live, hundreds and hundreds of years, would their teens be the emotional equivalent of our teens? Would their 30s be the emotional equivalent of our 30s? Why? Because and as an example, as a counterexample, in David Marisek's novella, We Were Out of Our Minds with Joy, characters are very long-lived, and the characters, the protagonists, they have a kid, they get permission to have a kid, and they're getting advice on parenting because it's so rare. People need sort of training. And one thing they're told is like, your child will probably be an adolescent, psychologically for about 70 years, because that's just what happens when you live that long. And
I don't buy it.
Okay, and
I feel like that's the standard. Like, I am an elf, so of course I live 1,000 years. So my teenage years are the next 200, and I'm like, I don't think that's how it works. I think that's far too simplistic, right? I mean, I think that's not what we see. I mean, the fact is that, there is some of that. Okay, so there's two things that are happening. One thing is that, I mean, I don't want to spoil too much in the book, but there's a little bit of a cheat in terms of how the plot goes, that the Fift that we see at the end of the book is more having the experience of someone that chronological age closer to our world than the average person in Fift's world would have because of what happens with Fift, right? So if we're talking about the end of the book, then most people who are the age that Fift is at the end of the book are still, are definitely in some ways adolescents in terms of their situation, still very much under their parents' care, right? Like you're the first century of your life, you are meant to be. I mean, it's a little bit different for Staids and Vails, but like your first 22 years, you're really a child, and then between 22 and like around by 100, you should really have left the nest and be doing some stuff on your own and forming your own, living your own life. But there's a large range in there from 20 through. So plenty of 80-year-old Staids are still living at home. And some 50-year-old Vails are already heading out on their own. So yeah, in some sense, there is in terms of the condition of your life, and we see that today, right? Like so people who were 14 in biblical times were like having babies and going off to war, and now 14-year-olds are, not anywhere near becoming independent. And indeed, plenty of now millennial, post-millennial, like plenty of people at 20 are still under their parent. Like we're going back to extended families that are have longer ages. And that's happened, it's been different throughout history in lots of different ways. But you go back and read Romeo and Juliet and, look at the course of the Middle Ages. Yes, they were having babies and going off to war at 14. Also, they were 14. Like they seem 14. They also were going off to war. So there's you know what I mean? Like it's not as simple as you just linearly scale it out. Like when Fift is going through puberty, Fift is going through puberty. They're biologically, they didn't just linearly extend biology so you hit puberty at 50. Like they're still you know what I mean? They're still undergoing the biological changes that they're undergoing. And then at a certain point, they just start maintaining their bodies and having, they just fix things. They're aging normally, they're not senescing. Right. So they're having their, you know what I mean? Like in many ways, the emotional life of a teenager is the emotional life of a teenager, and their material conditions may be different if they expect to be in school for another 20 years, or if they're already expected to be earning a living and having babies. But there's a way in which there's stuff that's not different. So I feel like I was always annoyed by the elf thing in a way, where it's like, I'm a 200-year-old elf, because it's like, you are a person, you've been learning, you've been experiencing. Did all the experiences just slow down? Like your adolescent rebellion was just like, Mom, I won't do it for 20, 30, 40 years. Do you know what I mean? I don't buy it, is what I'm saying. I don't buy a linear scaling. I think it's actually interesting to look at, because I think that's more, it's not just like when our lives were shorter, that they were just like a compressed version of what we do now. No, they were fundamentally different precisely because teenagers with teenagers' hormones and in many ways teenager like feelings were in a very different economic and political and social condition that gave rise to very interesting things. And so, so 15-year-old Fift is really 15 and expected to stay at home for another 80 years, which is different.
Okay. All right. I think we will. You and I could argue about this at length, but it's time.
Looking forward to it.
Can we have an extended version of the event that's just a big argument?
Hey, sure.
The first question that we have is from Sarah, who says, how do you feel that the economics of the unraveling interacts in our cultural discourse with the new financial instruments like NFTs?
I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like I'm struggling to say something intelligent about this. There's a way in which, like, the wackiness of, like, the weird efflorescence of things we're seeing, like with crypto and everything, in which we're boiling the planet quicker to do really inefficient programs so we don't have to trust each other at all, is really interesting. And it's kind of like, it's sort of, in some ways, it's kind of like the opposite trend, right? I'm sort of imagining a society in which there's all this like rich information. And so so much about strangers that you are doing this reputation economy style thing. That's like an interesting concept. But of course, like, that's not where we are right now in the precipitous decline of human civilization. We're actually like, we've got, if the book imagines us putting the brake on like, a world of mistrustful strangers, like the real world is slamming the accelerator on a world of mistrustful strangers, right? And that's interesting. I mean, it's very interesting. I don't know. Certainly there is I don't know. Certainly it feels there's a lovely weirdness to it. I mean, I both fear crypto because it currently has like the energy expenditure of Argentina and rising in a steep curve, and also I feel like it has a lovely, like, it's like, it's one of those things that's now reality that would have been like thrillingly, hilariously weird science fiction 20 years ago, right? So yeah, I don't know. I feel like and it's also this I mean, symbolically, I feel like there's also this predominance of the virtual and digital world over the physical, right? So NFTs specifically, like the NFT of the Mona Lisa, which is somebody having like you can make an NFT of the Mona Lisa, I think, and sell it, and it's not Leonardo da Vinci. Did Leonardo da Vinci paint the Mona Lisa? Who made the NFT? You could just go. I don't know. Like it's a very. It feels like a sign of this dominance of the virtual over the physical. So I guess it's something that would make Thave and Siab nervous if they were here. That's my answer.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Cliff that you answered, I think, a little bit after it was asked, but it says, Ben, are you planning to revisit this universe in future works? If so, what new aspects do you want to explore?
Yes, well, I should say that there are, I believe, 2 other things out there which are in this universe-ish. One of which is, as I said, Bereft I Come to a Nameless World, which is in Asimov's, if I'm not forgetting anything. The other of which was in a funny little magazine called Sci-Fi Journal, spelled PHI, so like Science Philosophy Journal, which really loves you to just throw world building at it. Like they love found text stories. So I just gave them some world building from Reef 6, which is a place that Siab goes while Thave is writing that letter to Siab that's at the end of this book. Or no, long before that. Anyway, whatever. It's one of their adventures. I do feel like it would be interesting. I do want to, in the prehistory of this book, Siab was the original protagonist of this book back before when it was called The Resilience. And I cut 40,000 words and fired Siab because we were having a labor dispute. And Siab wouldn't do what I wanted Siab to do, and made Fift, who was originally local color, the protagonist. So that's actually the prehistory of this book. And I am, so Bereft I Come to a Nameless World is some of those 40,000 words salvaged, and I do intend to salvage some more of it. I don't actually know if, and I sort of vaguely have an idea that I had a vague idea of a sort of what could happen next, but I don't know that there's actually, I don't have a handle on like a story about Fift when Fift is 500, which could happen, but I don't know. I don't have a glimmer of that yet. So yeah, so there's some pieces, and I don't know, might tie back together, but I don't know what I'm doing.
Cool. Thank you so much. That is the time that we have, but I just want to say thank you so much, Ben and Ted, for the conversation, and that I will be listening to the podcast now, as should everyone else. And thank you to everyone who's here in the audience. We can't see you, but we know that you're there. And yeah, do you have any final thoughts or questions before we say goodnight?
I just really appreciate both of you and everybody for coming and for doing this. And yeah, just this was really fun. And I wish we could just keep going.
I know, it'll for your next book.
Is there a convention in the States that you'll be attending, Ben?
Good question. I'm sadly not going to make it. I think I'm maybe going to be virtually at Worldcon. I'm not going to be able to be there physically. Probably the next one is, I try to get to WisCon every year, so here's hoping that next year I will be at WisCon. How about you, Ted?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'll probably go to ICFA in next year, the International Conference on the Fantastic and the Arts, in March. But that's not one you've ever been to, I think, Ben.
No, I've never been to ICFA because it never works out timing-wise. But who knows? Maybe could happen one of these times. Yeah, my kids are growing up, so once they are, I'm not as tied to the Swiss school vacation calendar once Noah's graduating. So I have another year of being tied to the Swiss school vacation calendar. And then maybe March will be as accessible as May. So could happen.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Thank you both so much. And
Thank you.
this is available for replay at the same link where you joined tonight. So feel free to share it and
Terrific.
watch again as necessary.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Good night, all. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Skylight Books podcast series. Please don't forget to visit our website at skylightbooks.com and make sure to follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast for more author talks and bookseller conversations. You can find us on Podbean, iTunes, and Spotify. Stay safe and healthy, and we hope to see you back in our store soon.